Hi there. All right, so we are now going to finish the database exploration assignment by going over the CRAAP test for evaluating sources. So the CRAAP test stands for currency, relevance, authority, whoops, accuracy, and purpose. Okay, so basically the lesson here is that we don't want to just choose any random source that happens to be about our topic. We want to look very closely at the sources we're going to use in our papers to make sure that they are meeting high standards and good academic credibility. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with this. This one's probably going to be a little bit of a longer video, but I will put some chapter breaks in it. So if you need to look at a section at a time, you should be able to do that. So critical thinkers use the best quality sources in their writing, currency, relevance, authority, make sure what, yep, there we go, accuracy, and purpose. Okay, so the first thing that you want to do is make sure you're using the most current information for your topic. So I generally tell students to steer away from any articles that are older than 5 years old. Very current topics will require more current sources. Some topics, older sources might work, but for the work we're doing in English 101, I would say stick with the most recent sources that you can find. Okay, so the question on the document here that you're going to be working on, when was the information posted or published? If there's a revised date present, list both the posted date and the revised date. So my example actually did have that. It had two dates. Why is it important that this information is as up to date as possible? What might be an issue with outdated material? So that's where you're going to answer your question about that. So if I were writing about technology and I'm using a source that's 15 years old, what could be the problems with that? Okay. All right. The next criteria that we look at is relevance. All right. So this is where I need to tell people not to just find any random source that's on the same topic. You need to remember what you're doing with this source that you're finding. You are trying to use it to help you respond to whatever you selected for your R2. So if you are mostly agreeing with your R2, maybe this source brings in more evidence to help you agree or additional points that R2 doesn't cover that show that you agree with R2's viewpoint. If you disagree, then maybe this source is going to bring in some counter evidence to what you read in R2 to help you disagree, right? If there's something that the author of R2 didn't cover that you think is an important part of this issue and this argument, maybe your R3 has that. So you need to make sure that you're looking pretty closely at what you select as your R3 to make sure it has information in it that's going to be helpful to you. Otherwise, it's going to be useless. Okay, so let's look at some of the, let's see what we have here. Does it provide information that you need? Does it provide specific information that you need? Because we're usually going to sources for specific information, not general ideas. The other thing you want to make sure is that you can read and understand and explain the information in your own words. This is sometimes one of the problems with more academic journal articles is that they're written for experts by other experts. So it might be very difficult for those of us who are not experts in the field to be able to explain that. And that's something you need to be able to do to work with a resource. Okay. So you want to consider the audience and whether you're part of that audience. All right, so let's see what the questions are here. Relevance. How does this source relate to the original topic or answer the research question? So basically, how do you feel like this interacts with your R2? Okay. What does it cover that is going to help you respond to R2? Who might be the intended audience for this source and how do you know? So I'm going to go over a little bit about audience. What other sources did you look at before you selected this one, and why was this the one you chose? So here's where I would talk about the two that I found on the SIRS database that were from the Washington Post and why I chose this one instead. One of the reasons I lean toward this one is more current. And it also is bringing in like newer issues that the original authors didn't talk about. So this one talks a little bit more about like how everyone has Ring doorbells. So I just thought that was going to be an interesting point to mention in my response. Does this source reflect the ideas of many other sources, or is it expressing an idea that no other sources feature? So, like I said, this one seems to be talking more about the Ring cameras and like the individual um, personal security cameras, whereas the other ones were talking more about kind of governmental, I guess, or law enforcement security. So that's why this one seemed to bring in a different point. Okay, so you're just going to answer these questions about the relevance of your source. Let me talk a little bit about audience. I think, does it come up next? Yes, here we go. All right. So it's sometimes challenging to identify the intended audience, and here's why you want to identify the intended audience for this um, assignment, and it will be especially important when we get into Unit 4. So this is kind of practice so that when we get into Unit 4, it's somewhat familiar to you. So when you think about the author's intended audience, it's like, who are they trying to reach, right? It's not necessarily who the article is about, but we'll get into that, who it's not. So one thing you might think about is who typically reads this publication. So if I'm looking at the New York Times, I want to figure out who's a typical reader of the New York Times, okay? Generally, probably a little bit older. They tend to lean liberal. Um, they tend to be fairly well educated. Like those are some of the characteristics of the readers of the New York Times. And sometimes you can look it up. Who is the audience of the New York Times? Who would be interested in or who would benefit from this information? All right. Now, it's very tempting to say everybody, but that's not really a good way to answer this question. And you can really think about all these questions and then figure out who your author's intended audience is. Look at the sources cited by the author, who would value those sources of information. So let me bring over and see where his sources are. First thing I'm looking for are hyperlinks. So here is an author of a book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. Here is, oh, it's not showing for me. Come on. There we go. So when I hover over the hyperlink, if you look down in the bottom left, it tells me where that information came from. ericpisa.net, I'm not familiar with that. Porch Pirates, New York Times. So those are the only hyperlinks I see. So who else does he get his info? Oh, here's a bunch. NYU, New York Times, ABC 7 News, NPR. Okay. San Francisco Mayor.org. New York Times. Okay. So he's citing a lot of newspapers, some kind of fairly liberal publications. So again, that's telling us who his audience might be. So if you are using the database, the SIRS database, you're not going to have these hyperlinks, and that's a problem that I'm concerned with this assignment. So we'll figure that out. Let me see where else we see legislation. So right now I'm skimming to see if there's any other sources that he quotes, that he cites. Here's the mayor's press secretary, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, do little to reduce crime. Matt Goriglia, a policy analyst at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, who is against this policy, this camera policy in San Francisco. Ring spokeswoman. Okay, so we're just kind of seeing, and we're going to come back to that actually, where they're getting their information from. Okay. References the author makes. Who would understand those references? Let me see if I can find an example here. You kind of look for like what he explains and what he doesn't explain. Came to Amazon tomorrow. When I talk about references, it means like, does he talk about any like movies or music or anything like that? Keep it unplugged. You know, Porch Pirates, like the people know who Porch Pirates are. his audience does. Let me get back to the beginning. Anything that moves. The deer that devour my rose bushes the instant they bloom. Like that's, who is going to relate to that idea, you know? So again, it's kind of fitting in with that sort of um, older adult, like not old, but older adult readers. There's a lot of stuff in there that feels like they tend to lean liberal, um, kind of well off and fairly well educated is kind of who he's writing towards. Let me see if I had anything else on here. The other thing that I think about, and I don't have it on here, is like if he's arguing for something to happen, who could make that happen? And I feel like he gets at the end, he talks about like that he's going to get rid of his Ring doorbell. I'll plug my camera in when I leave the house to go on vacation, but I'm going to keep it unplugged because he's basically saying that these are not good. You can avoid using cameras to monitor indoor spaces like bedrooms, and you can disable their microphones. So there are people that might have these cameras, right? That's who he's kind of talking about because he has the U in there. All right. So the audience is hardly ever everyone, the general public, Americans, all right? So please don't write that. And nor is it the people the article discusses. Maybe it is, but it hardly ever, it isn't necessarily, all right? So please don't put this as your answer for who the audience is. Please. Okay. All right. So that's relevance. Okay, now we're going to get into authority, and I think you've done some practice with this where, oops, that's not what I meant to do. We looked up the author. There we go. So you might Google the author, find out what their education is, what their employment is, their area of expertise, any awards or honors they've received. That's not what I meant to do. Okay, so we have Brian Chen over here. Brian? Yes, Brian X. Chen. Now sometimes, all right, he's coming up Brian Chen, NYT, so that's New York Times. Sometimes if there's a lot of people that have that name, you might have to put in like journalist or something like that. So I'm going to look at his bio. Lead consumer technology writer for the New York Times. He writes a weekly column for the New York Times on technology. He focuses on the societal implications of tech. He focuses on the erosion of privacy in an era of digital surveillance, impact of AI, and the inability to hear dialogue in streaming shows. Covered the technology industry for more than 15 years. He wrote for Macworld. Let's see. Journalistic ethics. Doesn't say anything about his education. Back when he worked for Apple, he worked at Wired. So he knows technology pretty well. All right. So I would say he is, kind of an expert on this topic. And just see if I can find Brian Chen, MIT education. Oh, here we go. LinkedIn. Let's see if it's going to tell me. Experience. Macworld. Education. Okay. So he went to UC Davis and he was an English major. Okay. Fair enough. So I would put that on this document over here. So who's the author? Brian Chen. What credentials does the author possess? So he was an English major at UC Davis. He has written about technology for decades. Experience with Weirder, Wired magazine, Macworld, and tech reporter for New York Times. Okay, here's where I found this information, was his bio on the New York Times website and his LinkedIn profile. All right, so you want to make sure you're writing where you get this information from. And if you copy and paste directly from the source, make sure that you're putting quotation marks. All right. Okay, the credibility and bias of the source. So the source is the publication or the website. Now, I believe I've gone over some of this in a previous lesson, but we want to make sure that we're looking not just at, like, is it a .com or anything like that. There's two resources that I've given you to check the credibility of the source. And one of them is called, I'm trying to find my article again because I closed it out. There we go. One of them is called Media Bias Fact Check. I'm just going to type it here. All right. And the other one is called Ad Fontes Media. Right. These are your two sources where you can look to see what's the bias of the source that you're looking at and what's the reliability or credibility. All right. So Media Bias Fact Check. First of all, one thing that's kind of cool about Media Bias Fact Check, if you're interested, is you can do this little add-on. I have it on Google Chrome, where if I'm reading an article here and it's from a magazine or newspaper that Media Bias Fact Check evaluates, I get this little icon here. So see that LC, it means left center. And I can click on that and it'll give me a little bit more. These media sources have a slight to moderate liberal bias. They often publish factual information that uses loaded words to favor liberal causes, generally trustworthy for information. And then I can click on this and it'll take me to the website and tell me a little bit more. Now this is the website, a lot of ads and blinking stuff, which makes it look not very credible, but it's a good resource. So here's New York Times way over here. It's not here, but it's left center, but still high factual reporting. And then high credibility, right? And it does say that the failed fact checks were on op-eds, opinion pieces, and not straight news reporting. Yep, I know. There you go. Okay. They are considered one of the most reliable sources for news information due to proper sourcing and well-respected journals and editors. So that would be something that we could put here. Nope. Here. All right. So Media Bias Fact Check rates the New York Times as highly credible with a left center bias. Oh, it's going to come back up here too. Ad Fontes Media. Let's see if it works for us today. Ad Fontes Media. It's been giving me some trouble lately. Interactive media bias chart. It just takes there's so much information, it's just taking a long time to load. Oh, yay. Okay, accept, close. All right, so this is a lot of stuff here. These are all magazines, newspapers, TV things. All right, so you can search over here and it'll just isolate that. And you can see it's right in here, so it's to the left, but still in this high credible over here, right? If it's in a green rectangle, it's pretty credible, right? You'll notice that the less bias, the more credible, all right? Okay, so it was right in this general area here. So we could write that as Ad Fontes Media places the New York Times in the, what's that green rectangle say? Most reliable is slightly left leaning in bias. Okay? So that's how we would write that. I'm going to say where we're getting the information from and what information we got. I did mean to say up here. Okay, so this is Brian Chen. Not Brina, Brian. All right. Up here, you do want to sum up, list any outside sources, what academic, all right. What does this information tell you about his credibility in writing on this topic? All right, so I want you to give me like a sum up. So I think he's pretty credible. What are the strengths and weaknesses, okay? All right, let's go to accuracy. There we go. All right, we did check the source. Google, media bias fact check, okay. All right, we want to make sure the information is accurate. Now, since it's coming from a pretty credible source, I'm giving it, I don't feel like I have to dig that deep, but we want to look at where the author's getting their information. Are those sources reliable? If facts or statistics are used, can you check their accuracy against another source? If no sources are cited, how do you know the information is accurate? Oops. All right. So again, this is where we want to look at who he is quoting or citing and his hyperlinks, where his hyperlinks are coming from. All right, we already did this, but we have New York Times, so we know that's pretty credible. San Francisco Mayor.org, I think that's okay, right? It's coming from the mayor's office. NPR that's going to be up in that green rectangle also. ABC News 7 is probably going to be up in that green rectangle. Okay, so NYU, oh, that's New York Times. So the hyperlinks all seem to work. Like they all seem to take us to pretty credible sources. Now, again, here's the problem. If you got your article from the CRAAP database, it's not going to have the hyperlinks, and that's unfortunate. So what I tell people, if you found yours on the CRAAP database, the one thing you can look for is what I did after I checked the hyperlinks was I went in a little bit more closely and I looked at who is being quoted. So Matt Gariglia policy, right? So I would kind of see who that person is and are they trustworthy. So if you can't check the hyperlinks, you can at least check this. The Ring spokesperson, but they don't tell us who that is. I thought there was another person that they quoted. Shoshana Zuboff, the author of The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. Right, so, these seem like fairly credible people, okay? Those of you that are finding your articles on CRAAP, another thing you could do is once you have the article title, you could go to Google and try to find that article online and see if you can look at the hyperlinks that way. If you need help with that, let me know. That's one of my frustrations with CRAAP. So we just got to figure it out. All right. So where are they getting their information from and does it seem accurate? The last thing we're looking at is the purpose of the information. So what is the author trying to do? Oh, wait, I'm sorry, I didn't go over to the document here. So, boop, boop, boop. This one. Close that. All right, accuracy. All right, were there any hyperlinks to other sources? If so, where did the hyperlinks lead? What types of sources were cited and referenced? All right, here's where you can write a note like, I found mine on CRAAP, so there were no hyperlinks. If no sources were linked, how can the accuracy of the information be verified? So how do you know it's accurate? Did it seem to fit with what you already know about the topic, or does it seem like kind of wacky? And what about the language? Does the language seem pretty straightforward, or does it seem overly emotional? Right? Make sense? Okay. So purpose, what's the author trying to do? Are they just trying to inform us? Are they trying to convince, persuade people? Are they trying to sell something? Are they being clear about that intention? Or are they trying to be shady, sneaky? Does the information seem to be mostly fact, some opinion? Propaganda is uh, like overly manipulative kind of language. Is the point of view objective and impartial? Like, is the author trying to be pretty straightforward with this, or are they being a little bit too much favoring one side or the other? Everything's going to have bias in it. It just depends on how upfront the author is about their bias. Can you discern? Can you determine any biases, personal, religious, political, anything like that? So let's see what our question is over here. Okay, yep. What's the general purpose? So if the author is persuasive, that's general. What's their specific purpose? What are they trying to persuade their audience to do? So general is going to be persuasive, informative, entertainment. Specific is going to be more about the topic and the audience, right? What are they trying to get there? What are they trying to teach their audience? What are they trying to convince their audience to do? Does the author seem to have like an agenda, or do they seem to just really be trying to get the information out there? Fact, opinion, propaganda, or a combination? Any biases? Okay. After you've done all that, you're going to do an overall evaluation, and there's two parts here. The first thing you need to convince me is that the article is going to be useful to you. All right. So how does it relate to your original article? Does it complement? Does it contradict? Does it give new information? Does it clarify? Anything like that? Tell me here why this article is a good one for you to use to respond to R3. Tell me why. 2 to 3 sentences. The other thing that you need to tell me why you think this is a credible article. So you're just going to sum up what you learned from doing the CRAAP test up here. Like basically, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the article? Okay. So some things to keep in mind. Okay, here's the purposes. The criteria are not generally yes or no. Yes, it's authoritative. No, it's not. Yes, it's accurate. No, it's not. It's more on a continuum. So like maybe, one thing it's very strong. The other thing it's kind of weak, right? Oops. So you need to kind of look at overall. Does it seem like in general it has more strengths than weaknesses? And are the weaknesses things that you can deal with? All right. So the whole point here is that as you start going out there looking for your own sources, you need to be very selective, very deliberate, right? And make sure that you're making the best choices, not just the first one that you come across. Now, don't be overly picky also. Sometimes I have students that are like, it's not meeting all the criteria. If it's meeting most of them and the other ones, it's still kind of okay, and that's probably fine. But the whole point is, there we go. Select the best sources. Don't you dare settle for fine. All right. You only need one source, so make sure it's the best one for this article, for this paper. Make sure it's the best one. Okay. All right. Let me know if you have any questions, and happy searching. Bye.